Let's see, I think people are just joining us. So as people are coming in, I'll just do a quick introduction to London Funders and the Festival of Learning. So welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us on day 5 of the festival, and welcome to this session, which will be led by the Corra Foundation. I'm Milena Bratley. I have recently started at London Funders. And before I hand over to Alan, who'll be chairing this session, just want to give you a quick intro to London Funders and the festival. So London Funders is all about helping funders in London be more effective by connecting each other and by collaborating to make the lives of Londoners better. And the festival is really intended to bring together our members for reflections, learning and insights from the last year, and really used as a springboard for discussion and action in the funding community as we head towards recovery and renewal, and we really want to build a movement for positive and progressive change, and the festival is really a platform to do that. So just some practical information. This is a webinar, which means you can see us, but we can't see you. So if you're having breakfast, we would know. And if you have questions for the panelists, please do put them in the Q&A box. And if you have any comments or thoughts, you can use the chat box for that. Also, we have plenty more sessions coming up today and tomorrow for the festival, and I'll put a full link to the program in the chat. If you want to tweet about the event, the hashtag is London LearnFest, and you can follow us on London Funders. So with all that practical information out of the way, I'll hand over to Alan Farmer, who is Head of Plays at the Corra Foundation, and he'll be chairing this session. So Alan, over to you.
Thanks, Milena. It would be nice to say it's good to see you all, but slightly strangely, it's that's not how the webinar is functioning. You'll just have to put up with our shiny, happy faces. I'll introduce my fellow panelists and a little bit about Corra Foundation in just a moment. I mean, the key focus for the session today is really sharing some of the lessons that we've learned from our shift to participatory grant making. The format will include a mix of presentations and conversations. We will try as much as possible to pick up on some of the questions that are coming from you guys as well through the session. If time is against us, then London Funders and ourselves are very happy to pick up on some of those conversations afterwards. So just quick round of introductions. As Milena said, my name's Alan Farmer. I'm Head of Place with Corra, so I head up our place-based work, which kind of goes beyond our grant making into how we work alongside communities to support community participation, voice and change. Delighted to have with us today Beth Logan, who is on the decision-making panel for the Promise Partnership, and was also involved in the independent care review and the Promise, which preceded the establishment of that. We also have Blair Wycherley from Intercultural Youth Scotland. They're one of our partners on the Equity programme, and Blair's been supporting young people who were interested in the participatory grant making process. We've also have Emily Wallace, who is leading on our work around the Equity Fund, in addition to developing some of our place-based work, and Kelly McFadden, who's been leading on the delivery of the Promise Partnership. You will hear much more from all of them over the course of the session. That's where the interesting stuff happens. For those of you who don't know, Corra is a Scottish foundation that exists to make a difference to the lives of people and communities. We work with others to encourage positive change, opportunity, fairness and growth of aspirations to improve quality of life. So since 1985, we've distributed in the region of £193 million to 24,000 grants to charities. And in early March 2020, we launched a new strategy, which is a 10-year strategic horizon. And that was a response to the world we live in and the world we want to play a part in building. The astute amongst you will have noticed that the launch of the strategy coincided almost directly with the pandemic and the lockdown. So we've had a real opportunity to stress test some of those aspirations. At the heart of the strategy is a strong belief that when people find their voice, they unlock the power to make change happen. And we really firmly believe that participation and participatory grant making are the kind of key fundamental components to supporting that strategic shift and to supporting that positive change. I think that's probably enough from me for now. And I'd like at this point to introduce Kelly, who will talk in a little bit more detail around the Promise Partnership work.
Thank you, Alan. Right, I'm going to share my screen. Can you just, I take it, can you give me a thumbs up if you can see it? Yay, okay. Right, so thanks for the introduction, Alan. My name is Kelly McFadden and I'm the manager of the Promise Partnership. I am going to tell you a little bit about the Independent Care Review, how that led to the Promise and the Promise Partnership, and then just kind of touch on some of the kind of experiences we had earlier on in the year. So in 2016, Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister, made a commitment to figure out how Scotland could love its most vulnerable children and provide them with a childhood that they deserve. Now, this led to the Independent Care Review. The Independent Care Review carried out a roots and branch review of the care system across Scotland. And that involved listening carefully to those with experience of living and working in and around the care system to properly understand what needs to change to improve it. In February 2020, the Care Review published 7 outputs, and the main volume of which was the Promise. Now, the Promise laid out 5 foundations and over 80 calls to action, and Nicola Sturgeon pledged in Parliament to keep the Promise along with support from all other political parties. So fast forward to July 2020 and the Scottish Government announced a £4 million investment to support families and keep the Promise. Now, Corra worked closely with the Promise team throughout the summer to hear directly from their consultations to get a better understanding of what is needed within the sector. So this led to the development of the Promise Partnership. Now, the Promise Partnership consists of the Scottish Government, the Promise Team Scotland, and also Corra Foundation. And Corra's role within this is to administer the funds. So we opened the funding round with the £4 million investment on the 1st of March. The funding round closed on the 1st of February, sorry. The funding round closed on the 1st of March and funds had to be committed by the end of March. So we had a really tight turnaround on this. So in terms of the funding routes, we had 2 funding routes. We had the open call, which were infrastructure grants. So these were grants for organisations to challenge their internal practices, their internal culture. Grants could be a maximum of £50,000. And they were anyone working in the public, private or third sector within the care system across Scotland would be eligible to apply. So we received 85 applications, 67 of these were successful, and we awarded £3 million in grants. And we also had the diagnostic route. So this was invite only. And this was for organisations who were working in collaboration with other partners who had already began on that journey in terms of embedding the Promise within their organisation. So they were a little further forward than the open call applicants. So we invited 6 collaborations, 5 of these were successful, and we awarded £1 million in grants. Now, the voices of children, young people and families were really what kind of shaped the Independent Care Review and the Promise. And so it was really integral to this fund that we took a participatory approach. So we wanted to involve those working in the sector, but more importantly, we wanted those with first-hand experience of the care system to have the power and make the decisions of where this money should go. So we did 2 things. So in January 2021, we advertised for short-term advisory group members. So we were lucky enough to get 8 people who were working in the public, private and third sector across the care system in Scotland. They brought knowledge of systems change, knowledge of service redesign, and some of them also had their own personal experience of the care system. Now, they worked with us over quite intensely over a short period of time to agree the criteria, to help set the funding parameters, and also establish the application process. So at the same time as this, we advertised for the decision makers panel. So the decision makers panel ultimately would have full control over where this money would go. So we were lucky enough to have 8 people be involved in the panel who brought a wide range of skills and attributes. All of them had their own experience of the care system, but they had a real kind of a knowledge and just an understanding and just the importance of what was actually at stake. So I think it's worth mentioning here that, you know, the panel members were so committed to this process. They all had other commitments. So they had full-time jobs, they were full-time college students, they had family members, they had all of this stuff going on. And then we asked them to commit a whole lot of time over a short period of time to kind of, you know, make these decisions with us. So we were so grateful that we ended up with a group of people who were really passionate about this. So they worked with us over a period of a couple of months, and they developed the assessment process. They assessed all of the applications, and I think it was approximately about 200 funding application that the 11 members assessed over a 2.5-week period. So that should give you just some indication of the amount of hours and time that they'd committed to this. They made all of the final assessment decisions, and they helped us kind of compose the feedback to all of the applicants for the diagnostic and the open call route. So what worked well? I think in an ideal world, we would have said it would have been great to have had the panels face-to-face. However, you know, for obvious reasons, we weren't able to do that. But what we realised from having the online meetings was we were able to engage people from across Scotland. So, you know, we had people from Edinburgh, Glasgow, North Ayrshire, the Isle of Lismore, and, you know, just that recognition that these people would not have been able to commit that amount of time if these meetings had been face-to-face. So the online meetings actually did work quite well. The next thing, I suppose, which was really important was, and Beth may touch on this in her conversation shortly, but the strong relationships that the panel members had with each other. You know, from my point of view, from Corra's point of view, it really felt like they were in it together, and there was a kind of a real team effort towards the panel. We value people's time, so we paid people for their time and their participation, and we also provided that kind of time and space for supportive challenge, which was really important. In terms of what could be improved, I think one of the key aspects for Corra the Learning was having kind of structures in place before embarking on something like this. So in terms of the payments for participation, this was quite new for Corra. I think before, when we'd paid people for participation, it'd been kind of vouchers or things like that. So we'd never actually paid kind of large amounts of money before. And because of that, it took a while to get these processes in place, which was frustrating for me, but I would imagine frustrating for the panel members, because, you know, it meant a delay in their payment. Another key thing was the opportunity for skills development and training. You know, if we'd have had time, we would have liked to have offered more support around this to the panel members, you know, and asked them kind of what their training needs were and supported them to kind of achieve that. I think, you know, if we were to do this process again, that is something that we would definitely make a priority. The framing and language, we made, you know, a few mistakes around kind of how we frame things and the language that we use. And I think, you know, again, going forward, we would want the panel members to be more involved in that and really kind of have those deeper conversations about the preferred language. Another thing was that the quieter voices in the room. So we were really aware that those seldom heard voices were maybe not part of the panel, and that's something that we'd like to address going forward. So we're pulling together a paper at the moment about all the learning from the decision makers panel and looking at what we could do differently to maybe encourage some of those voices to be involved in future. And I suppose the key aspect was time, and time fed into all of these things really, because we were so against it. We were kind of, having to kind of do things, just get things done, rather than having that kind of time and space to sit and reflect and, take more time over the design of the programme and have more time to engage with the decision makers and shape the applications and all of these things. So time was obviously a really kind of key thing which we would like going forward. So in terms of the lessons learned, we are pulling together a paper on the whole process, which will be shared with the Promise Team Scotland, Scottish Government, and also published on our website. So we're looking at the process, what we could do differently, how we could improve it. We're looking at the role of the decision makers panel, what could we offer them? So again, looking at kind of training and that kind of thing. One of the key things that came out from the applications was seems to be a real kind of need in the sector and support around participatory approaches. That kind of came across that people are actually struggling with that. So looking at providing some support to the sector around that. And we're also kind of consulting with the applicants to get a sense of how it felt for them to be involved with the fund and how we could kind of improve that going forward. We are also working with the Curious Collaborative. So this is a group of funders with an interest in this area. We're sharing the knowledge and the learning from this funding round, but also having conversations about future investment opportunities and what a future fund should look like. So that's just kind of a summary of the Promise Partnership and how we got here. And I'm going to hand over to Emily, and Emily and I will recap on some of this later on. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kelly. So I'm going to do a quick roundup of the equity programme. So what I do need to say before I go into this is we're still in the middle of the equity programme. It's not finished. And so the learning from it hasn't been finalised. We're very much still in the process of learning about it, but it has worked quite differently to the way the Promise has worked in terms of participatory grant making. And so I think it's probably worth just giving you a really quick rundown of what the equity programme is and kind of how it came about. So I'm going to share my screen now. Let's see if this works. That one. Okay. Okay, so the equity programme came about because in August last year, Stuart Investors, an investment company in Edinburgh, approached Corra Foundation and said, we would like to give you some money. We are aware, we know that Black and minoritized communities have been hardest hit by the pandemic, and we're not sure that money's getting out to them. Can you help us? At which point Corra, who a lot of our grant making is actually done on behalf of other people, so a lot is done on behalf of the Scottish Government. We do a lot of partnership working. And we said, we'll give it a go. We'll get that money out for you. And so what we agreed to do was to split the pot that they gave us. £50,000 of so the whole pot was 150,000. £50,000 was proactive grant making, which we'd done quite a bit of through the pandemic already. We'd done some emergency grant making on behalf of the Scottish Government. And we already had kind of systems in place to get money out really quickly with reducing the kind of onus on the organisations to give us the information and making sure that we were being really responsive. So that first £50,000, we gave around 30 grants of between £1,000 and £2,000 to the majority of the organisations were Black and minoritized community led. excuse me, 22 of those groups we already knew, they were already on our list, but 8 of them were new to Corra. And I'll come back to why this is quite important for us going forward and some of the learning that we got out of it. The other bit of the pot, the 100,000, was for community-led grant making, which is another kind of phrase we use around participatory grant making internally. So we had £100,000 and we decided to work with a series of different groups around Scotland. And a lot of this was based on our internal knowledge and our internal relationships, our existing relationships. And some of it was based on conversations we had. So we did 2 things. We developed an internal team very, very quickly. So my day job was working on large-scale participation projects, which obviously through the pandemic had significantly reduced in scale and progress. So I took on the equity fund and we brought together a small team around it, some of whom were our colleagues who were from Black and minoritized communities themselves. Some of them had worked extensively with different organisations. So the different groups that we chose to work with were the Roma and Romanian community over in Fife, because a member of our team speaks fluent Romanian and actually already had a door into that. And what we realised was, as Corra, we perhaps didn't have the networks into every Black and minoritized community across Scotland. So we started, half of the work we did was with contacts we already had and communities we could already get into quite quickly. And the other half were with communities that we didn't know very well. And we spoke to a lot of organisations. We did a lot of listening, a lot of talking, a lot of finding the places that we didn't have those networks and really finding out where the need was and which communities we could work with. So we work with the Roma and Romanian community. We have a children and young people strand, which is kind of 2 strands. So one, Blair will talk about, we worked with Intercultural Youth Scotland as an umbrella body. And we're also working with Multicultural Family Base with kind of younger children. We were in touch with a group of Bengali women and also through the pandemic were aware that that particular community had been hard hit by the pandemic for a number of different reasons. And it just so happened that there were a group of women, Bengali women, who didn't feel like their voices were represented in the organisations that might normally represent them. And they wanted to start their own group. So we started to work with them and develop a group around that. We worked with MCAS, so the Minority Addiction Support Service in Scotland, around a men and mental health strand. And we also, through the conversations we had with umbrella bodies, with grassroots organisations, with the organisations that we'd spoken to through the proactive grant making, we realised there was a real need for culturally appropriate counselling. People were dealing with multiple traumas through the pandemic, through Black Lives Matter, through the stuff that had come up through George Floyd's death. And actually the appropriate counselling wasn't there. So we put part of that 100,000 pot towards a culturally appropriate counselling service that was already being developed by BMIS in Scotland. So, as I've said there, what was really important for us was the realisation that the networks and connections that we had with communities at local level were absolutely key. Some of them we had, some of them we didn't. And that actually traditional grant making in a lot of ways can exclude communities. And if those communities have been excluded for a long time, it's not enough to expect other communities to come to you. You need to find the places where your communication is not getting out. As a funder, if you want to shift power, the onus is on you, not the organisations. You should be actively out there kind of listening and talking and finding the places where you're not getting through, because in order to shift the power, you have to be in those places, you have to turn up. Working with communities, again, who are minoritized and who may historically have been minoritized means taking time. And I think this is why we did this kind of split approach. So we worked with communities we already knew, but then we took a lot of time to work with communities we didn't and develop relationships there. And I think what this has done is allow us to see that we're perhaps not reaching as many of the communities in Scotland as we could do through some of our more traditional grant making. And there are definitely gaps in the data available. There were gaps in our internal data as well around what groups we were reaching, where they were and who they were, whether the groups that we were reaching who supported Black and minoritized communities were in fact Black and minoritized led. There was a lot of stuff that had come up through the grant making. So our aims were really to work with minoritized and seldom heard voices that we had seldom heard, with the aim of really for us deepening understanding, but also increasing agency within those communities and opening up dialogue. We wanted to develop capacity for groups and increase confidence and build trusting relationships to support a shift of power. So we realized that power and trust are kind of intricately linked, and actually for us, we needed to work in ways that allowed that to happen. And so what we did is that both the investment in time and trust meant that we actually have worked in different ways with each of the different groups we work with. So very briefly with the Bengali Women's Group, they are quite informal grassroots type group. We have experience working with them through our place work, but we're working with them in a much closer way than some of the other groups. Some of the other groups we learned we were not the right people to be in the room when the decisions were made. So Blair will talk about Intercultural Youth Scotland. So for lots of people, it's important that there's a trusted voice in the room when you're asking them to make a decision. And so for Intercultural Youth Scotland and for the Minority Communities Addiction Support Service, they are both led by not by us. We're not in those rooms, we're supporting from the background. And actually, for us, that's really about starting where people are and listening to what people need and how you need to move forward. And I think unlike Kelly's experience, what we have found is Stuart Investors have been very open to us really adapting and flexing with the programme as we go. So we have been able to take different approaches with each of the different groups. So as I said before, it's really important that we work with the wisdom of the groups and those different approaches. But as Kelly said, it's also really important that we provide resource for organisations, those trusted community members, but we're also paying people. So we're paying facilitators for their time. We're paying participants for their time. We're saying we want to hear what you have to say and we really value your time. Gathering and sharing learning, we're kind of in the process of that, but we've been quite open about how we do that. So we're not asking people to report in a very formalized way after the process is finished. I think our aim would be sometime later in the summer to get everybody together to have a kind of collective wisdom gathering session. And then hopefully we would have multimedia produced of some of the learning, both from the groups and from us as a funder, because we want to start thinking about different ways that we can allow different groups to share their learning and experience with us. And that's us. I will stop there.
Thanks very much, guys. I think that was a fantastic overview of those two programs and some very broad overarching themes around the importance of power and trust, but also some very practical points around time, and the time it takes, how you value that time, and the importance of relationships and networks and how you build those, which I'm sure we'll come on to in more detail as we go across. so far we've heard from Corra's perspective around this, but I think it would be both right and important that we hear a bit more from Beth and Blair, who've been involved in those two programmes, and to just hear a bit more about their experience around things. So we'll open up just a bit of a conversation with you guys just now. And I wonder, just to start off with an easy one, I mean, why do you think that participatory approaches are important? And Beth, can I come to you on that one first?
Yeah, of course. So I think that participatory approaches are important because it's important that we kind of give that power back to the communities that we seek to serve. It's important that we don't become too precious over what it is that we are hosting or holding or contributing to. I feel that when you include everybody in the room in a meaningful kind of way, and when everybody's on the kind of same level, that's a real kind of starting point for moving forward, and it's a real statement of intent that the communities that we seek to serve, that we are open to listening to them, that we are open to giving them agency and autonomy, and that we're open for them to carry out work on our behalf.
I can see you nodding there, Blair. Is that does that resonate with your experience?
Absolutely, and I guess just to give a bit of background into IYS and what I do, I'm the youth work manager for Intercultural Youth Scotland, which is a Black and POC young persons charity. So in terms of participatory grant making, it's very often that the people or the community that we have in our sphere are very, very far away from any kind of decision-making process, especially when it comes to decisions that are made in their communities. So I think this was a fantastic opportunity for our business in IYS when kind of Corra came along and said, you know, there's an opportunity for your young people to actually take the wheel in terms of making things happen in the community for the first time. And then for myself to kind of be the middleman in linking the young people in Corra, so that's kind of linking the finances and then the decision makers, and that gives them the opportunity to decide themselves what they think would be the most valuable for their own communities, because it can be quite assumptuous for us or people in different communities to make assumptions about what other communities might need to bring them up. And I think it's very important to kind of give that power to those who are in that space, because they will know what they need, but also have the ideas and creativity to kind of expand upon where they're potentially lacking. So yes, I absolutely resonate with what Beth said.
That's great, thank you. And in terms of getting involved, I mean, what kind of helped you to decide to step into that space?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, for us, I think the opportunity is just fantastic. We have hundreds, or I would say hundreds is good, but we have many young people who are interested in coming to IYS because we're constantly giving them opportunities to kind of advance their personal careers, but also give them training and also provide a safe space for them to kind of share with their friends and so on. And then this opportunity is giving them the chance to look at something that they would have never been given before. They've never been given any money in any kind of real with real weight behind it, and told to kind of spend as you will. And I think a lot of young people have had a really tough time actually thinking about how to spend the money. You know, they're very much, and we must save every penny, and you know, they're trying to spend £50 when they've got far more than that. I'm like, guys, you know, we need to broaden our horizons here. So I think for us, it's a great opportunity for the young people to really learn what it's like to actually be at the kind of decision-making table. So that's what got IYS very much involved in this project, because we want to give our young people as many opportunities to grow and learn as possible.
I think for me, being care experienced as well, and experiencing every aspect of the care system since birth, I was really committed to the cause and being involved in the independent care review myself prior to the decision making panel. I've been dedicating my working life for the past 5 years into the care system in Scotland and ensuring that we can build a safer, fairer and better childhood for our children to come. So I kind of felt that when I seen the opportunity, that it was something that spoke to me, and that I really wanted to get involved, because I had been invested in so much kind of surrounding the independent care review and the promise up until that point. I also wanted to kind of solidify that and make sure that funds were reaching the people that we seek to serve, and reaching those communities, and reaching the people who can really make a difference on the ground. Because it's one thing having policy and practice and like documents such as the promise, but it's another thing about how that translates into practice on the ground. And I was really keen to make sure that I was able to have a bit of influence, I guess, over how that money was spent, and kind of how organisations were going to help kind of realise the promise, and how they're going to work together to make sure that we do build childhoods rather than create a further kind of systemic process to that.
Yeah, and I think just listening to you guys describing that, I can hear very clearly the commitment and the passion that Kelly described as well in her input around just the commitment that everyone involved in those processes has brought, but also the acknowledgement that, for participatory grant making to succeed, Corra as a funder needs to think about where power lies, where the decision making sits, where our networks do and don't reach, and to have the benefit of your experiences as part of those processes. That's where the fundamental strength of them lies. I think Emily and Kelly sort of shared earlier as well what they might do differently. Is there anything from your perspective that you would do differently if you were involved in a similar process again? I'll go to Beth first.
I think kind of Kelly touched on it in our presentation. I think the biggest thing for us was time. There was a lot of work that had to be done in a very short space of time. And don't get me wrong, we pulled it out of the bag and then some. But we, I suppose, in order for that process to flow better and for, I suppose, to be able to get better consistency across the board and stuff like that, having that bit of extra time would probably have been useful. Things that I would also have done differently is probably taking more time to kind of build up relationships, because relationships are so important in any kind of work that we do. So I think that by the end of the process, we'd all built up very kind of sound relationships with each other, but it would have been nicer if we had kind of more opportunities to do that at the start of the process as well. So that was kind of one thing that I would change. I guess like a lot of reflection came from Kelly's presentation around kind of the use of language and how we frame things and stuff like that. And we did have a couple of kind of things in the group where we thought, well, that language isn't sitting with us right, and Corra were fantastic and be like, okay, like, we're sorry, like kind of putting our hands up and saying, right, okay, we got this wrong, how do we rectify it, how do we make it right? So that's something that can only be commended, because that hasn't always happened in other forums that either I've been involved or my fellow peers have been involved in. It's sometimes something that's brushed over the carpet. So that's something to be that's commendable on Corra's part as well. And I think as well, for the fundamental process of it, I don't think I would do much differently. Given autonomy and agency to the decision-making panel to decide the process of how the applications would be marked and scored was something that was hugely important to us, because it gave us that sense of ownership over the process. And I think as well, kind of making sure that the group knew that they could add and amend and change things as we went along, and that it was a living, kind of breathing process, and we were open to that kind of change and challenge, I think was really useful as well.
Fantastic, thank you, Beth. And just picking up on the autonomy and agency and changing process, Blair, I'm aware that you're kind of still in the midst of the equity program work.
Yeah, exactly.
So some of that might be emerging learning, but is there anything that you might think about doing differently either this time or in future?
Well, I think, yeah, you're absolutely right. Because we're in the middle of it. Yeah, I think our presentation is this week, so we're very much in the last moments and the kind of cramming phase, as everybody is at this point of a project. So yeah, that's why in terms of the what to do next, we're still finishing the first run of it, so we don't have the actual T's and C's of what we want to do next. But in terms of what I think kind of initially what would be useful moving forward, as Beth says, time is always our greatest friend, and you need those time to kind of fill out the ideas and then turn that into actionable outcomes. And I think for the young people, I think perhaps what would have been easier for them, given their situation and their age and their knowledge about, you know, investing in money, perhaps some more parameters would have been easier for our young people to decide what to invest in, because you can give a young person a budget and they're going to say, let's build a rocket to the moon, because, you know, they have that very youthful optimism. So I think maybe a bit more of an understanding or just a kind of knowledge of who's actually making these funds, because a lot of the young people don't know about kind of spending money. So maybe some more parameters in terms of what actionable outcomes would like to be seen from the funding and the participatory grant making would make it easier next time if we were to use a different group. However, I'm sure that, you know, given that we have like 7 young people working on this current project, I'm sure if it was to go back to them, the same group of 7 next year, they would have a much easier time of making those decisions in a way which is easier, much more easily managed. Because, yeah, as I said, we're sending a rocket to the moon can take a few more people than just the 7, 16 and 17-year-olds. So.
I think sending a rocket to the moon may have stretched our budgets as well, but but I think it's a really interesting dynamic between being open almost entirely to the voices and the views and the ideas of young people in this instance, but presenting an opportunity in a way that allows them to kind of engage with it most effectively and as quickly as possible. Would there be any lessons that you think funders should consider, or any steps that funders should consider if they were taking an approach like this?
Well, I absolutely think that there should be more of this, and I think it's really good that this is the kind of start of this type of funding, because if we can manage to do this in a way which funders and grant makers and, you know, people who are deciding on where those funds go, I think it would be a fantastic kind of a community or circle of spending in the community. So I absolutely think do more of this as funders, giving the money to the actual people where the money is going to impact. And I guess finding potentially organizations like IYS who can help administer or bring the community to the funders themselves. That could be an easy way to do it. Or sometimes, you know, you can cut out the IYSs of the world and go directly to the young people and or whatever groups that you're looking to help give a leg up to, because I'm sure that, you know, financing and investment in communities absolutely makes the changes. It's just sometimes you need the assistance in terms of where is the decision coming from, and if you can give that power to the people, it can often help communities massively.
That's great, thank you. Beth, is there anything from your perspective that you would want to add to the mix?
I suppose just to say that, like, participatory grant making isn't new. It's something that's been around the ether for a while. But I suppose it's about having that courage to take that leap, to actually create a process that works for our communities, served by our communities. And I think that the biggest thing that I would take home from that is to continue to seek out those opportunities and those spaces for collaboration, for influence, those spheres of kind of relationship kind of based approaches and stuff like that as well, and also making sure that you have the time to carry it out kind of properly, and also as well looking at how we best serve the people, because it won't be a one-size-fits-all approach for everything. You're going to need to be flexible and adaptive to each different community's kind of needs, but also there's nothing more kind of satisfying and powerful and I suppose just kind of heartwarming to see when a community takes control of their own kind of lives, their own space, their surroundings, and no matter what that community is, but when that community takes back that control and kind of carries it out, that there is nothing kind of more wonderful and more kind of powerful and awe-inspiring than that process.
That's great, thank you very much. And I think, so yeah, hearing very clearly the need for a flexible and adaptable approach in relation to specific communities that a funder might be working with, but also that need for funders themselves to be more flexible and adaptable in their approach and thinking through both the time that the work might take and also how their existing processes help or hinder with that. Thank you very much to both of you guys, Beth and Blair. I can see we've got a few questions coming into the Q&A. Try to pick a couple of those up in no particular order. So there's one we've touched on time. There's a question around why the time was so short for the two programmes and whether there was some pushback to funder imposed deadlines. Kelly, I can see you've come off mute already. That's very encouraging.
Yeah, so for the Promise Partnership, the reason we had such a short timescale, it was down to Scottish Government budgets. So the funds had to be committed by the end of March 2021, and so it was just a really tight turnaround, and there was no kind of leeway with that. So that's where that kind of came from.
Okay.
I'll just make a note on time there, because the equity programme has actually really shifted in terms of time. We were supposed to be finished by the end of April, and that was never going to happen because of the flexible way that we'd been working with the different groups and the different needs of the different groups, and also there was a global pandemic happening. And we were lucky in as much as we've been able to stretch that timeline out, but actually, as Blair was saying, there is a need for some parameters around work that you do. What we're doing is working with each of our groups to set those parameters with the groups within what we can resource as a funder as well, because we've got a kind of people resource thing. So there's a, for us, I think it's been more about a conversation with the groups that we're working with and ourselves, rather than us imposing deadlines. We had originally imposed deadlines on the work and then really quickly realised it just wasn't going to work. We wanted to do it properly.
Great, thanks. And I suppose that leads on to a further question about how the participatory grant making fits with our normal processes. So specifically around whether the committees of people involved in the decision making were a substitute to Corra trustees or staff for approval of the grants. Yeah, if you could just give a bit more detail on that, I think that would be great.
Yeah, so I can answer from the Promise Partnerships point of view. So, you know, normally at Corra, any kind of grants that are made would have to go to the board for, you know, obviously ratification. But in this case, the decision makers panel had full autonomy. So, you know, there was no appeal process. The decisions didn't need to go to the board for ratification. Scottish Government didn't need to approve the awards that were made. The full and final decision sat with the decision makers panel, and that was that. Does that answer it? I'm not sure.
That seemed pretty comprehensive.
And it's very similar for the equity fund as well. The groups themselves are making the decisions about how the funding's spent, and it doesn't need so it's not coming back to us. It's not coming back to either grant assessors internally or the board, which I think is probably quite an interesting thing for us as a funder, looking at our work in the whole, in the round, and what the interaction between those two ways of working are, because we do still have some traditional grant making that we're doing.
Great, thanks. Just a very quick practical question as well, Kelly. Could you give a bit more detail on the Curious Collaborative?
Yep, so the Curious Collaborative is a group of different funders who kind of meet regularly, I don't know, monthly, every 2 months, to kind of share any key learning or best practice. And so, you know, the Curious Collaborative, all of them have a keen interest in ensuring that, you know, they are involved in driving forward the promise. So that is the Curious Collaborative. Yes, it's a group of funders who kind of share kind of key learning, and at the moment they are really keen in the promise, and so they are looking at how they can support this going forward and what that would look like.
Brilliant, thanks. And the last question that we have so far relates to the participatory grant making approach and well, how that relates to community development and empowerment. So Emily, I don't know, given your significant work around participation and place-based approaches, do you want to say a little around that?
Yeah, so I think actually it's a key part of the mix. So as Alan says, most of my day job used to be working on participation approaches and community development approaches, and actually part of the reason I think why Blair spoke about the parameters around the grant making, part of the reason why the parameters weren't set is because grant making wasn't my trade. I was more about the community developments, but that's been an interesting flavour to bring to the grant making, I think, because my focus is very much around community development, around participation, around how you work with groups and organisations and communities to really understand their needs and put things in place that can meet those needs and also raise aspirations. So from my perspective, it's a slice of the same pie, and actually I don't think you can have participatory grant making working well if you're not got wider participation and empowerment within a community. And actually that grant making, as Blair was saying, when you're talking about raising up communities, that might look different for different communities, but actually that process of raising up and raising aspirations, when we're thinking about the future and we're thinking about legacy, once you raise a community up, you can't just then say that that's done. That becomes an ongoing relationship into the future, and empowerment actually is a journey that you walk together. It's not something that happens in a single moment in time. It's a process that we're continually going to be in. And I think that's why it's so exciting for us as a small foundation to have both our grant making arm and our place, our community building arm, and have the two learning from one another.
Perfect, thank you. So pick up one final question in the Q&A, and then maybe just close with some of the learning points from Corra's perspective. I'll open this to anyone who wants to to chip in, but do you have any tips about how to avoid ending up with the same sort of circles or networks when a funder's trying to build new networks, specifically where they might start and initiate new relationships?
I don't. I don't have, no, it's an interesting point, because for me, I'm relating this to the seldom heard voices. So how do we kind of start listening to, and how do we get access to those people that are not necessarily heard? And I'm not sure how you do it. I mean, we are currently reflecting on the process that we've just been through to look at, okay, what would we do differently, and how could we kind of encourage engagement from that kind of different group? But the short answer is I'm not actually sure how we do that at this moment, but it is something that we are conscious of, and it's something that we do want to address. And so if anybody watching this webinar has got any tips or any advice on, you know, what would be the kind of best approach for that, I'd welcome that. But yeah, it's something that we are currently grappling with at the moment. Sorry, I know that wasn't very helpful, but I just wanted to kind of chip in.
That's absolutely fine. That was helpful. Beth, I know you spoke about, you know, part of what kind of really drew you to getting involved was the potential to reach people on the ground that weren't previously involved in decision making. Could you maybe say a little more around that?
Yeah, so in the past when I've been working with marginalised groups, mainly those that have experience of care, I think that the biggest thing is not having a place or a kind of connection, or not being tethered to somewhere or someone. And I think that getting in there and kind of having a very much relationship based kind of practice and focus kind of helped me in my kind of early career of kind of getting people around the table and getting people speaking and kind of setting up activist groups and stuff like that kind of lobbied for change within the care system. And Emily was absolutely right in what she was saying about once you've elevated and you've raised the standard of practice and of care and of compassion that you give a group, you can never kind of bring that back down. All you've got to do is keep building on it and building on it. So I think that kind of for me, those kind of spaces were always about kind of not having any expectations, kind of going to where people are, not expecting them to come to us, but kind of getting out there within the community, whether that be kind of street-based youth work, or kind of meeting them at different points, at kind of hosting kind of things in schools, or anything when it was specifically kind of young people we were looking to work with. So it was kind of about being a bit more innovative as to where and how we could reach people, and also kind of being authentic, because people can tell a mile off, and especially marginalised communities, they can tell a mile off if you're kind of not being true to your own values. So I think that kind of having that strong value base, but also being really, really authentic is hugely important. And also the thing that I would kind of take away at the end of kind of every shift or whatever would be that I've made a little bit of headway. Let's just kind of keep on pushing on.
Thank you very much.
Can I come in very briefly, Alan?
Yeah,
I know it's
absolutely
tight.
No, there's plenty of time.
Just because with this point about the networks that we didn't have, so this was massively embarrassing, I think, for us internally to realise that we didn't have good networks of Black and minoritised organisations. We had a list. We did have a list that we had funded in the past, but it wasn't huge. So what we did was we started with the people we knew. And I had an awful lot of conversations. I lifted the phone to a lot of people. I organised a lot of Zoom calls, and I spoke to people about their experience through the pandemic, about what was happening for them, about what was important in the communities that they were working with and working for, and that they were part of. And I kept asking them every time I'd finish a conversation, who should I speak to next? Who do you think I should speak to? And what that allowed me to do was to get into places where, organisations I didn't know, communities I didn't have any connection to, by making those relationships. And also, as Beth says, always going in, realising that I didn't know anything, and actually the expert in that room was the other person, and kind of, valuing and honouring that. And I know we still don't have it right, but we now have connections with people who know a load of stuff and have a load of expertise that we can pick up the phone and ask, what do you think about this? What should we be doing about this? How can we do this better? And I think actually when you start valuing people's experience like that, they become more willing to share, and your relationships and networks broaden. And again, I'll just go back to that point that Beth said about authenticity and about relationship-based practice. I think it's absolutely key. You need to come into the room, whether that be online or in person, and be authentic around that.
Fantastic, thank you. And I think that addresses to quite a large extent as well the supplementary question around the power dynamics and how funders might look to start to engage with communities that they've not historically reached. So that's excellent. So I think we've got about 10 minutes of our session left, and would suggest that we just use that to wrap up. So if there are specific sort of lessons learned from your perspective, Emily and Kelly, that you would want to share, Similarly, Beth or Blair, if there's anything that's really kind of come up for you during the conversation that you'd like to just share or re-emphasize, please feel free to do so. So I'll hand over to Kelly in the first instance. Does that make sense?
I think Emily and I are gonna maybe have a chat. I suppose the key things that came from this is, even though the two funds were very different, we, after having a conversation, realised that there was kind of 4 key things that were relevant for both funds. So I think we just said we would kind of have a chat about those kind of key points. And so I'll kick off. I suppose one of the key things for the Promise Partnership, and Beth's touched on this earlier on, was around relationships and just the importance of relationships and the relationships that Corra has with the decision makers panel, but also the relationship between the panel members themselves, and really, yeah, how just important they are, and how we would have benefited from having more time to kind of establish and build those relationships before actually just, you know, agreeing on the panel and then just getting what felt like straight into the business. So that's something that, yeah, was a kind of key thing for us. Do you want to come in on that, Emily?
Yeah, so Blair's just left us there. I'm not sure if people noticed that Blair had another meeting that he's had to zip off to. But yes, I think in terms of relationship for us, like I said before, so half of the relationships with the organisations and groups we're working with through the Equity Fund we already had, and half of them we're building. And that has taken a different amount of time and needed a different approach for both things. But actually that relationship-based practice is completely vital for the success, I think, of these projects, and also being able to fail, being able to get things wrong. If you've got those good relationships, then when things go wrong, people are much more willing to go, that isn't working, we need to do that differently, or actually can we stop doing that and do this instead. And for this kind of learning experience for us as a funder, for this kind of participatory experience and grant making to work, we really need to have the relationship where the people we're working alongside can say, that's not working, we don't do that again. Because it's the only way that we're going to learn together, and actually learning together is absolutely vital.
And that's so true. And that was kind of one of the key things, and I suppose this kind of leads on to another point, but you know, the relationship that we had with the decision makers panel allowed them to say, actually, you know, we're not happy about the use of language, we're not really getting the framing of this right. And we were completely oblivious to it, you know, and it was like, right, okay, you know, thanks for pointing that out, and we'll make sure that we don't do this again, and we can make sure that actually we share that learning with other funders and make sure that kind of we take that forward. So, and I suppose that kind of leads on to the framing and language point about, you know, again, putting everything down to time, but because we were just so against it, and, you know, rather than taking the time to kind of talk things through with the decision makers panel about, right, okay, what is the preferred use of language? How would we, you know, what would this tweet look like? How should we promote this? You know, we kind of just went ahead like a bull in a china shop and did it, and then realized afterwards, oh, that wasn't the right way to do it. But again, we are, you know, this was kind of a new experience for me and for Corra. And so there's been so much learning from that for us.
Yeah, I think that point around framing and use of language, particularly if you're working with minoritized voices or seldom heard voices, or voices that you seldom hear, is really important, that you use the language that that works best, and you don't decide what that is. And there's lots of levels in that as well that you need to be aware of, that the language that a group finds acceptable might not be the language that individuals within that group find acceptable, and vice versa. So I think certainly with the Equity Fund, we found it much more comfortable for everybody to talk about each group as a group, rather than try and find a term like the really difficult term BAME that covers an enormous amount of the population and actually says nothing about the individuals or the groups or the experience of those communities within that umbrella term. So language, and I think it's, you come out of the gate saying, okay, what language are we going to use to talk about this? How are we going to talk about this work? How are we going to describe it? And because actually that will lead you to framing, not just around the language that you use, but the framing. How do we talk about the work? How do we talk about how we work together? Do we use the word partnership? Do we use the word working alongside? What are the words that work for us? And it's going to be different, actually. And you can, I think, as a funder or working for an organisation, you can key into using specific terminology, and it just becomes a shorthand for you. And sometimes you like Kelly, you just trip into using something that you just hadn't really considered. And actually, you do need to consider work when we're working with different communities and different individuals.
It was quite interesting with the language as well, because a lot of the applications that we saw, and Beth will be able to back me up on this, and these were well-established organisations who had been working in the care system for a long time, kind of should know better, were using language that, you know, the panel were like, I cannot believe I'm reading this in an application. And so it was really eye-opening for us, you know, as Corra staff, to actually see the amount of people and organisations that were actually getting language wrong. And the good thing about this process and about the power being held by the decision makers panel was all of these applicants that had used these, you know, the wrong language, we went back and told them, and we said, actually, you need to stop that, you know, and we were completely honest. And I know that a lot of them have actually kind of responded, and because it came from the panel, they've kind of taken that with more authority, if you like, you know, rather than a funder coming back and saying that. This has come from real people who are saying, we don't like this use of language, so you need to stop it and you need to change it. And so we're already kind of hearing back from organisations where they're saying, actually, we're starting to put these changes into place already, which is fantastic. Great.
Yeah, certainly is. One of the other key lessons was around time, and somewhat remiss of me as chair, perhaps, but we're rapidly running out of time. So what I would suggest is that we just draw today's conversation to a close. As I said at the outset, Corra and London Funders are very happy to keep the conversation going. We are incredibly grateful to have had the opportunity to take part in the Festival of Learning. And yeah, hopefully there will be some conversation that we can continue with you guys as we move forward. I'm conscious that there are a number of sessions that a lot of you are moving seamlessly into, and that will give you a short break between them. So in concluding, I'd just like to thank my fellow panelists, Blair, who's already headed off to another meeting, Beth, Emily and Kelly. I hope, like me, you found the session today to be useful and thought-provoking. And yeah, enjoy the rest of the festival. Thank you, Melina, for your help with today as well.
Thank you so much, Alan, and just echoing what you said, there's been a really great and insightful session. Thank you also to everyone who's come. Just to say, I've reposted the full programme for the festival in the chat. We still have quite a few sessions coming up today and tomorrow, so please do consider signing up. And yeah, thank you so much again for taking the time to facilitate this really great session.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks now.